We're live. Just wait for a few people to join. And I want to be talking about the effects of today's budget on not just homeowners but home buyers, especially those who are coming out of relationships and perhaps have their name on a deed of a property already. In her wisdom, Rachel Reeves saw fit to increase the stamp duty surcharge from 3% to 5% effective from tomorrow. But what does that mean? Now, many of you may be thinking to yourselves, well, this doesn't affect first-time buyers, second-time buyers. It only affects landlords and investors and so on and so forth. But that isn't actually always the case. There are many people in this country, a large portion of buyers, who are coming perhaps out of a relationship, and they have a house with their previous partner where their children live, etc. And for whatever reason they haven't sold it, or perhaps they can't sell it. There may be a court order in place that their previous partner can remain in the house with their name on the mortgage deed until the children have grown up, for example. And these people move on, meet somebody new, and these two people want to buy a house together. If either one has their name on the deed of another property, then the stamp duty surcharge becomes effective. That's 5% on top of any applicable stamp duty. So if you're in the southeast, that's going to be quite a big hit, because with the average price being significantly higher, for example, on a £500,000 property, that's an extra £25,000 you will have to pay in stamp duty. Now, if you sell your designated home when you buy another property within 3 years, you can reclaim that. So in that situation, all is not lost, because you can reapply for a refund of the stamp duty surcharge when your previous designated home is sold. That's if it's within 3 years. If it goes beyond 3 years, there must be extreme circumstances, and for the main part, most of the time, that's refused. However, this still actually becomes an interest-free loan to the government for that period. And also there is always the risk that something could happen and you might not be able to sell within that 3-year period. And most importantly, you still have to come up with that extra 5% when you're buying that additional property on top of everything else, which is grossly unfair. This does nothing to help the hundreds of thousands of people who are trying to buy their first home, or perhaps they even want to move to their second home and are struggling because obviously as you go up the ladder, stamp duty costs are higher. So there may be people who want to move upwards now, but as I said, if one of them has a property elsewhere, regardless of the fact whether they have access to it or not, even if by court order they cannot use that property and only their ex-partner can live in it, their name is on their deed, then they have to pay the 5% stamp duty surcharge. This really is a tax on people who can least afford it. But conversely, corporations who can buy 6 or more properties in one transaction, here's a surprise, they don't have to pay it. They don't even pay the standard stamp duty rate. They pay the commercial and mixed use stamp duty rate, which is, I believe, 0 up to 150,000, 2% on the next 100,000, and then 5% on everything beyond that. So as a ballpark, think about it. The residential stamp duty rate rises to 12% on properties of 1.5 million or more. And many people who are buying higher end properties, perhaps have a home in the sun, have another property, they now, on top of the 12%, have to pay a further 5% stamp duty surcharge. Now, despite what everybody's being told by the industry about booming house prices, certain property, yes, has moved and has picked up from where it was a year ago. That, in many ways and in many areas, is being negated by the flood of ex-buy-to-let properties that are coming to market. There are, in fact, around 40% more properties on the market today than there were a year ago. And add to that the fact that George Osborne, when he changed the way stamp duty is calculated at the end of 2014, that brought the rise of property in the upper quartile to a halt. Then they added the 3% stamp duty surcharge. Then they added a further 2% surcharge for overseas investors, bringing the highest rate up to 17%. That is now rising to 19% for an overseas investor who is buying a property and it's not their designated residential first home. So what has in effect happened is the government used the higher end property in London coming out of the crash in 2008 to revive the market by encouraging overseas investment. And it actually worked, because all of these developments that were sat there after the financial crisis, at risk of all going bankrupt, recovered, survived to be sold on, and so on and so forth, and that filtered its way downwards. That's why this last revival from a crash in 2008 was different to previous property increases, where they are normally bottom up. That is, first time buyers begin to buy 2-bedroom homes, and that filters upwards and outwards from the southeast to the rest of the country. This time it was more a top-down property revival, again from the southeast, but by investors being encouraged to put their money into many of these high-end developments. Once the market recovered, the government then stiffened up all of the anti-money laundering laws, and then they began visiting these people who had invested in these large properties and conducting investigations into where the money came from, and many of them had their properties seized, their assets seized. So it was very naughty. Then with the restructuring of the stamp duty at the end of 2014, I believe, taking the highest rate up to 12%. Then with the additional rate, property in the upper quartile in London is worth less today than it was nearly a decade ago, on average, no matter what those with a vested interest in the market will tell you. And today's change will have an even more profound a downward effect on prices in the upper quartile, because as the prices go up, that extra 2%, taking the surcharge to 5%, becomes increasingly more significant. It's almost as though the government, previous governments and this one, but certainly from 2008 onwards, it's almost as though they turned the high-end property market in London into some sort of pyramid scheme, with those who were last in getting their fingers burnt and seeing no sign of literally recovering, which is not just unethical, but it's not good for the economy. I've always said that I disagree with encouraging overseas investors to just park their money into our property when we have so many people desperate for property, and yet half of London, central London in particular, sits there empty because it's just a car park for somebody's money who lives on in the other side of the world. But that's not to say that we shouldn't encourage overseas investments into our property market. This bunch of losers are literally running around scratching their heads trying to work out how they're going to finance building all of these properties, which hasn't even begun to happen and won't happen, certainly not in the numbers that they are promising. Whereas they could, using tax incentives, basically stick and carrot, they could encourage overseas investors to, rather than to park their money into existing property, shutting it off to people here who need property to live in, their investments could be directed more towards investment in building property, whether it's for first-time buyers, social housing, whatever the case may be. And with the right tax incentives, then the investors would be queuing up to put money into the property market here. That property would be made available to those who need it. Perhaps there could even be an arrangement in place that after 5 years they could buy a property at 5% discount, 10% discount, something so that the investor still makes a profit, but it would help the first time buyer or those who rent to be able to buy their home, and that 5 or 10% could contribute towards their deposit and give them a helping hand. None of this has been done, and all they've done is just go for the easy option to just increase the stamp duty surcharge to 5%. But what really adds insult to injury is that the corporations, Lloyds Banking, for example, who announced last year or the year before that they intend to be the largest private landlord in the country by 2025. As long as they buy 6 properties at a time, they pay a fraction of the stamp duty that hard-working people have to pay. That is beyond contempt as far as I'm concerned. This is the final nail in the coffin for investors into property, but it also affects the renovation of property. There are over 670,000 empty properties in the UK, many of which are derelict or unfit for use. The major developers have no interest in them because the margins are not big enough for them, so they're not interested. These properties are sitting there empty. The only people who will renovate these properties are people like you and me. Everyday British citizens and the British people on the whole love renovating property. And rather than offer an incentive, we had the previous government who eroded the capital gains tax allowance from 12,000 down to 6, then down to 3, so it's effectively 0. But keep in mind that with the exception, if the property is unfit for habitation and you are allowed to apply for exemption, you have to pay an additional 5% stamp duty when you buy it. Or if you're buying cheaper property that falls below the threshold where you wouldn't have paid any stamp duty, you have to pay 3%, which from tomorrow is going to be 5%. So what incentive is there for everyday people to buy and renovate these properties? And in fact, how are they supposed to make a profit when they have to pay an 5% stamp duty surcharge and they do not have the £12,000 capital gains tax allowance? For a couple, that would have been 24,000. Rather than lowering it, I would have suggested they increase it, but conditionally, i.e. then the capital gains tax allowance should be more on condition that the property is brought up to a certain specification with a certain particular energy performance rating, etc., etc. Because our housing stock is some of the oldest in the world and some of the most beautiful because it has character. It's wrong that it should be left to just deteriorate until it is beyond repair, especially when there are people who would be more than happy and more than willing to renovate this property, and why shouldn't they be rewarded for doing so? And when the properties are completed, whether they rent them or whether they sell them, it really doesn't matter, because every single one of those would be an additional property brought back into use. And if the tax incentives were reassessed to encourage overseas investors to look more at developing and increasing the housing stock rather than parking their money into existing housing stock, then these two things combined could really help to take the major part of the shortfall out of our housing crisis. But these people literally don't understand anything other than just tax. Taxes up, and taxes up again. All they've done is basically lie and punish the very people who rely on them the most. And I don't think many of us will be taken in by their insulting token gesture of a penny off a pint of draft beer, or the fact that they have rewarded us by extending the freeze on fuel duty escalator for another year. They have done a lot of damage today, not only to employers but to home buyers, be they first time buyers or be they second time buyers. And as I said, this stamp duty surcharge is not something that applies just to investors and developers. It applies to every person out there who is coming out of a relationship whose name is on the deed of another property. If you're buying an expensive property, and for example, you don't fit in to the criteria for changing your designated home, who would that apply to? Well, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you had one or more buy-to-lets, but you didn't own a home that was designated as your residential home. You still have to pay the 5% stamp duty surcharge because you are you are not moving your designated home. It is a tricky one, that one. But as you know, with HMRC, everything is skewed in their favour, and to be honest, they don't really offer any help to you. So that is also something that you need to look at, and I would strongly advise you to check your situation before you take it for granted and try and buy a home. If you've had a buy-to-let but you have not sold a residential home within the last 3 years, you might just not qualify to buy a property as your designated home. You should be able to, but the rules there are a little bit vague, so you need to get professional advice where that goes. Having said that, anything can be your designated home, and some would argue that if you were to buy a very cheap property, in parts of the country where they are very cheap, and designate it at your home and then sell it on, then you could then change your designated home to the one that you are buying. But once again, you need professional advice, because we are talking about thousands of pounds here, thousands of pounds that I don't believe that you should be paying, and especially when those who can afford to be buying half a dozen or more at the time are not paying anywhere near the standard rate you're paying, let alone the higher rate with the surcharge. If you want to look up the exact figures, just go to the .gov website, just search stamp duty rates, and then just look for the multiple dwelling rate, which covers properties, purchase of 6 properties or more in one go. It's there in black and white. You will pay 5% extra, unless of course you're one of our friends who can afford to buy 6 or more in one go. It beggars belief that this is the situation in Britain today, but it It's disgraceful, but it actually doesn't surprise me that under a Labour government that wasn't also reconsidered. So banks who effectively have a license to print money pay less than Joe Bloggs, who is working and struggling and making ends meet to try and buy their next home or an investment or whatever the case may be. Hello Oscar, what have we got here? What about the permitted development for a house conversion? I did not hear anything today. No, neither did I. Obviously, they are all in place, as are rules eased on commercial to resi conversion, which is all part of, I suppose, of the grand plan of just killing off our high streets as one by one shops are turned into residences. And here's another thing that actually is troubling me. I don't know about wherever you guys are, different parts of the country. Here in Northampton, our university the numbers are falling, it's in debt. I understand that that's the case up and down the country as it's become harder for overseas students, costs, and also demographic changes. And yet here in Northampton we are seeing all of these student flats being built. They're claimed to be student flats. My concern is, if the numbers of students, say here in Northampton, are tumbling, who are these flats really being built for? Are we literally being led up the garden path? I don't know. I won't go into that too much because that's going off on a political tangent, but I would urge you to look into that wherever you are. Look into the number of student flats that are appearing, and then perhaps do a little research on your local university. Are they in financial trouble? Most of them are. Are their numbers growing or are they shrinking? And if they are shrinking, what's going to happen to all of these student flats? Or is this simply a case that all of these flats are being built with the excuse under the cover of being for students, but in actual fact, then at some point further down the line, we will then be presented with an excuse why they need to go to another group of people. And will that group of people that they are designated for be everyday British people or not? Who knows? I think it's a case of watch this space and see. That's all I really wanted to cover today. I'm really disgusted by this, because it just seems to be one thing after another, and nothing is actually addressing the issue of the housing crisis. Nothing is being done to address the issue that young people can't buy a home or even rent in many cases and start their lives and have a family. Is it any wonder that our birth rate is just collapsing? Or are they simply taking the attitude that we don't need to worry about people starting families here? We can just change demographics by just importing people. Again, I don't know, but this is not the way that the housing crisis could be addressed. The scope for housing availability is there. Just with the empty homes and brownfield sites, which have the capacity for between 1.2 and 2 million homes. We don't need to lose a single acre of farmland for housing. Why are we losing thousands of acres for new housing, which is causing chaos on our infrastructure as towns are extending further and further outwards, with larger suburbs which have to use the same road to get in and out of town, causing traffic jams that then has to be dealt with, I suppose, congestion charge. I don't know what the next step will be. Whereas there are sites ready for redevelopment. And let's not even start on the thousands of acres that we're losing to solar and wind farms. We need this land for our food, and it is being lost because the major developers don't want to redevelop land. They don't want to renovate property. They want to build on a flat field ready to go and throw up their latest Lego land, sell it for as much as they possibly can, ensure that supply is always not just below, much lower than demand, so that their properties fetch a premium and then move on to the next one. And this government, just like the last one, has done absolutely nothing to address this. And raising the stamp duty surcharge by 2% with effect from tomorrow. What about those who have a sale in purchase in place now, who are due to exchange and complete in the next few weeks? What happens to them when they suddenly have to find an additional 2% on top of their purchase price? It's all well and good if they're buying a property up in the northeast for £100,000 or so, but if they're in the southeast and they're moving upwards and they're buying a property for over £1 million, that's upwards of £20,000 in stamp duty extra at a stroke of a pen from the very people who are literally dishing out money left, right and centre to their friends, to the unions, and down that bottomless pit which is the war in Ukraine. Absolutely disgraceful, because it's their job to ensure that the people of this country have a fighting chance for a future, and this is not helping people with their future. This is effectively making their future much, much more difficult, and the future for these young people is bleak. And the young people are important, and they are the ones that we as individuals, collectively as a society, should be looking out for, because it is obscene that young people under 30s, maybe even under 40s, can't buy a house as easily as we were able to 30 or 40 years ago. Something has gone badly wrong here, and nobody wants to address it, or rather they refuse to, because it's just a case of I'm all right, Jack, and everybody else can just share in a bedsit as far as they're concerned, and it doesn't matter if they can't have a family, because they're not concerned at all. Even the token gesture of raising the national living wage, it might at first glance appear good, but add to that the changes they've made to employers' national insurance contributions, add to that the changes in laws giving workers rights from the first day. So you're a small business, you employ someone, and an hour after they come to work on their first day, they decide that they're ill or they're twisted their ankle, you have to pay them, and you have to sit and wait to reclaim what you pay them, of which you can only claim a portion of it, not all of it. And if you're a small business, and you have to hold their job for them. So if you're a small business and that person then goes off sick and you take in somebody else and they do the same, that could be the end of your business. What incentive is there for people to invest? What incentive is there for people to employ? What incentive is there for people to buy and renovate property? And rather than just force businesses to pay more and more as a national minimum wage, I'm not saying that people don't deserve it, but how about making training and retraining more accessible, so that people have access to free or very, very cheap training and retraining, so that 1 or 2 or 3 years after they start work at national minimum wage, they are worth more than that, and they can get jobs that will pay them much more. And if they were to help them with housing as well, perhaps that would go some way to restoring some of this social destruction that combined, all of them have inflicted upon this country. This is not a good day for young people. It's not a good day for couples. It's not a good day for property. And it's not a good day for our economy. I always seem to be doom and gloom, and I do apologise. But ultimately, there's really no point in me being here to be telling you buy now because it's going to go up, buy now because interest rates are going to drop, buy now because property will never be as cheap, buy now because property has gone up by 189% in the last 13 months, according to this particular metric, or whatever the case may be. I'm here to tell you how I see it. Take it on board or not, because I don't want to see people borrow money to buy property that they may not be able to afford tomorrow, next week or next year. And I also fervently believe that everyone should have the opportunity to rent and then buy their own home as young as they possibly can. I don't think that it is acceptable that young people should have to spend the best years of their lives literally being bounced around from one bedsit to another, with the next month's rent being a concern to them almost every day of the year. That's not right, and that's not their fault. I think that's all I wanted to say really on this point. Unless you have any further questions, please feel free to ask. While I'm here, keep in mind there is, I think there's about 3 imposters now who've copied my profile, and you need to check the URL because mine is just Luxury Property Expert, and one of them has added an underscore before or after or whatever. I will never ever contact you for investment or crypto or to sell you anything, apart from a house, which I'll occasionally post a video or a property or an investment, but then that's my job. But nothing else. I'm not here to sell you any get rich quick schemes. So if you are contacted by anyone asking you to invest in anything privately, whatever it is, that is not me. I have complained to TikTok again and again and again, and they just don't seem to do anything. And this imposter has even gone as far as literally downloading or screenshotting, screen recording my videos and uploading them, and basically trying to exploit my profile to try and hoodwink people. So I'd be devastated if I thought that anybody had fallen for it thinking it was me, because it is not. So that if that's the case, please ignore and report and block. Thank you very much. Okay, let me just have a quick look. Thank you for everyone for joining. I'm going to look into this a little bit more and I'll make a more in-depth video. I do go live on YouTube frequently, both on my property channel and on my uncensored channel, where I have rants about everything, anything and everything political. Why? Because somebody has to, even if it does offend some people. Have a wonderful day, and sorry I haven't had news to cheer you up, and I'll be back soon. Bye bye for now. Thank you. Bye.